good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christoph Geist, and together with Beth Notar, who is my co-director of Trinity's Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel discussion on the life in the times of cholera. My colleague, Professor Maurice Wade, will chair the discussion, but before I put him in charge, I'd like to briefly tell you about the technicalities. You can ask questions to the panelists during their presentation by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom browser. Professors Wade and Notar will then forward those questions to the panelists. Also, the discussion will be recorded and will be made available to you later, so you can enjoy it as often as you like. And that's all I have to say. So Maurice, please take it from there.
Okay, well, first let me thank Beth and Christoph and Tess for organizing this. As Christoph said, I'm Maurice Wade. I'm in the philosophy department. And I'm going to very briefly introduce the panelists and then turn things over to them. Our first panelist is Dario Euraque, who is a faculty member in our history department. After he speaks, he will be followed by Sheila Fisher, who's a faculty member in our English department. And our third speaker will be Aldrete, who's a faculty member in the Hispanic Studies section of our Department of Language and Culture Studies. You're here to hear from them and not me, so I'll turn to Professor Euraque to get us going. Dario.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Dario Euraque. I teach Latin American and Caribbean history in the history department, and I want to open up with the following. I was asked to provide some historical context, possibly because that's what I am, a historian. Of course, I can't do that in 20 minutes or so, but I think what I wanted to focus on is the historical geography of Colombia, and which is context for the love in the times of cholera. And a central fact of that is the Rio Magdalena, which is a river that crosses straight through from the Andes right into the Caribbean Sea. And I want to dedicate a few minutes to that in order to make some specific points, because they're also relevant to much that is addressed as historical context in the novel. Rio Magdalena, which you see at the bottom of this map. And I wanted to make a point of that first. You may have heard, even if you didn't see that the Rio Magdalena, the Magdalena River here at the bottom part, which begins in the Andes south of Bogota, the capital of Colombia, flows down into the northern part of Colombia and into the Caribbean. And the novel is very much about that latter part of the Caribbean. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was very much a Caribbean person. And I wanted to make a point of that because I'll say something a little bit about the history of cholera and how it became part of the Caribbean as a bacterial disease. It was not part of the Americas. Believe it or not, the Europeans brought it into the Caribbean at the beginning of the 19th century. We'll talk briefly about that. I want to show another map to make another map of Colombia to make this more relevant. This is the northern part of Colombia that I mentioned. And as you noticed that there are some parts circled in yellow and in orange and in green. And I want to make a number of points about this. One is that Garcia Marquez is not just from the Caribbean, the northern part of Colombia, and through which the Magdalena River flows, but his parents came from or let me put it this way, different regions within the Caribbean. His mother, in yellow there, that's what I have in Spanish, madre, was from even the more Caribbean than the Northern Caribbean, meaning that if you see there's a little railroad here from Fundación to Santa Marta, which is a port right in the Caribbean Sea. That's where the United Fruit Company was established and exported bananas, not coffee, that came from the highland. And so his mother was from that area there. His father was from the southern part of the Caribbean part of Colombia, which is in the orange here, and particularly towards the southern part of the Caribbean part, to a place called Sucre here, which is also relevant to this, because his father and mother are very different, and this comes out in the novel as well, and not just in the novel, but many of the other novels of Garcia Marquez. Another point that I want to make is the circled green area, and it's right around Cartagena. Cartagena was the capital, basically, of the Caribbean part of Colombia. And the reason it's important, besides that, it was also the entry point of the African diaspora and slavery into northern South America. And that's important because of the relevance of race to Colombia and the Caribbean Colombia. And I want to make a point about that, because Colombia is basically divided into many, many regions, but a fundamental regional difference is, as you see in this map, the northern part of the Caribbean, which is this line in orange here pointing with this little arrow. That's the region where the novel takes place. If you see the river, you can see a little bit of the river Magdalena comes through here. And then the other Colombia, which is the Colombia that oftentimes gets more advertising in the United States, and it's the Andean Columbia. And that's the Colombia of Juan Valdez and coffee, and unfortunately, some time ago, but it still has a legacy, Pablo Escobar, towards the interior. Those are two very different Colombias. And most of the novels of Garcia Marquez, including, of course, Love in the Time of Cholera, take place in the other Colombia, that is the Caribbean Colombia. And I want to make a point of that, not just to identify and draw out its significance for Colombian history in general, but also for the novel. The novel takes place not only in that region, but broadly speaking, from the 1870s to the 1930s. And there are a number of things to take note of that. One is that it is at that point when the Rio Magdalena becomes really the central causeway. And that's what I unfortunately you weren't able to see in the first video. It becomes a central causeway of transportation, ideas, and much else between the Andean part of Colombia towards Bogota into the Caribbean. More importantly, for our purposes, is that the Magdalena River was also a conduit of disease, because as you know from the current pandemic of COVID-19, it is the movement of people that really is a great factor. And the Rio Magdalena became that as well. So while it generated great wealth in the transportation of ideas, music, and so forth, not just from the Andean region and to the Caribbean, but vice versa, but also the connections between the Caribbean part of Colombia, Panama, which was part of Colombia until 1903, until the United States invaded there in 1903, but also towards the rest of the Grand Caribbean, meaning the northern tier of Central America, Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Cuba, of course, the Dominican Republic, into as far north as southern Florida. So that flow of maritime trade between the Caribbean, the Grand Caribbean, into Colombian Caribbean was central not only to economics, but to disease. And I want to make a point of this. Cholera, as you probably know, you can look it up, I did, in the World Health Organization data, actually began in the Delta region of the Ganges River in India. And the way it came to the Caribbean was by Europeans who were infected, who came through the British Empire and into the British colonies, into the Caribbean. And it was through that flow of trade that I mentioned before, and up the Magdalena River and other rivers, that cholera outbreaks began in much of what is today Central America and the northern part of South America by the 1830s. And so the cholera that is presented in the novel has that broad world history involved. And I wanted to make sure that we understood that as we move forward. I want to end with one video that I hope I'm able to show you, which is the last scene of the novel from the movie, which many people, critics and others, have panned as a bad movie because of a whole series of factors, and we can discuss that if anyone wants to discuss the movie as opposed to the novel. I actually like the movie a lot for all kinds of my own reasons, and I especially like the last scene, which I'll now hopefully show you, because it not just brings up the relationship between love and disease, and what Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or Gabo as he was known in Latin America, short for Gabriel, which is explored in the novel, and I'm sure Sheila and my colleague Aldrete will address. But the scene also captures the relationship between the disease cholera in the Rio Magdalena, which is a central point that I've been wanting to make. Okay, I hope this works.
Captain?
Thank you, sir.
Captain, speaking hypothetically, speaking hypothetically, would it be possible to make the return trip without stopping? Without cargo or passengers, without coming into any port, without anything?
It's possible, but only hypothetically. As you know better than I, the company has contracts to fulfill. But there is one thing that could be done.
What is that?
If we had a case of cholera on board, we'd hoist the yellow flag and big parent tint.
Well, then let's do that.
I command this ship, but you command me. If you are serious, just give me the order in writing and we will leave right now.
Going to stay like this.
You can't mean it.
From the moment I was born, I have never said anything I did not mean.
And how long you think we can stay like this?
Forever.
Forever.
After 53 years, 7 months, and 11 days and nights, my heart was at last fulfilled. And I discovered, to my joy, that it is life, not death, that has no limits.
Cada día pienso en ti. Pienso un poco
I'm going to stop there. But I think you got the point. Yes? Thank you.
We'll turn to Professor Fisher now.
When we pivoted back in March, I went around my house and collected a group of novels and texts that had to do with plague literature. I had Defoe, I had Camus, I had Boccaccio, and I had Love in the Time of Cholera. And so I intended to steep myself in plague literature because it seemed like the good moment to do it. But of course, we were all totally stressed out as we pivoted last March. And by the time the semester was over, the last thing I wanted to do was read plague literature. So when Maurice asked if I wanted to be on this panel, I jumped at the chance because I read Love in the Time of Cholera for the first time, probably in around the year 2000, and I absolutely loved it, but I never got a chance to go back and reread it. So I thought this was my opportunity. And full disclosure, I've only read it in translation. I don't have any Spanish, as will probably become obvious when I pronounce characters' names. But I was just really looking forward to rereading it, not only 20 years on and in the middle of our own time of cholera, but also as I entered the world of the novel, I was finding myself, and I, for better or for worse, reading as a medievalist. I mean, this is my area of specialization in the English department. And as I moved in, it wasn't just the fact that we're in a pandemic and the period that I teach is characterized by the bubonic plague, or what's called the Black Death. But as I move forward, I became very aware of the fact that this is a work whose title says in the same breath, words associated with love and words associated with sickness. And one of the hallmarks of medieval literature is a kind of obsession with lovesickness. I'm not saying that the Middle Ages invented lovesickness. You can find lovesickness certainly in the Aeneid. If you think about Dido's death, you see lovesickness and Ovid's Metamorphosis also from the 1st century. But it's in the Middle Ages that lovesickness becomes one of the characteristics of literature. I mean, in the 12th century, courtesy of the Islamic influence on literature in Spain, through the permeable membrane of the mountain separating Spain and France, came what we call in the European tradition, the courtly love ethos, which was characterized by the suffering and attendance on love. What's interesting is that as you find this emblematization of love as suffering in 12th and 13th century literature, as the Middle Ages progress, and as we move into the 13th and the 14th century, medieval medical writers, taking their cue from Galen and Avicenna, start looking at lovesickness as a medical condition. And, based on Galenic and Avicennian texts, they start trying to figure out what's going on with lovesickness. And with the cyclicality these things, sometimes have, what happens is that what begins as a kind of literary trope then becomes part of the medical literature, and the medical literature then finds its way back into the imaginative literature. So by the time we get to Chaucer in the late 14th century, he's actually using the medical name in certain of his references to the suffering and the symptoms that go along with courtly love. And as I was reading, I thought, this is really kind of interesting because Garcia Marquez does something similar in Love in the Time of Cholera, in that he takes this whole sense of the medicalization of cholera and attaches that to Juvenal Urbino, Fernandaza's husband, who is a doctor who meets her because she is misdiagnosed with cholera. And then he takes the suffering that goes along with the courtly love tradition and love is a disease and attaches that to Florentino Ariza, who is the kind of guy who just eats, love literature up with a spoon and, stands in cemeteries and plays the violin to his own composition of the crown goddess, which he writes for her. In the 12th century, Marie de France wrote in her Le Guigemar, love is a wound in the body. It's a sickness that lasts a long time because it comes from nature. And by the time we reach the 14th century and the way in which love sickness has been given a medical spin, we realize that there's a certain kind of personality, according to medieval medical authorities, who seem more susceptible to love sickness than others. And this derives from the theory of the four humors that medieval medicine used in order to categorize both physical and personality types and the diseases and imbalances that each type could suffer. So in case you haven't reviewed the theory of the four humors recently, I'll just give you a quick brush up lesson. The word humor comes from the Greek for liquid or moisture or sap and was associated with bodily fluids. And these bodily fluids not only governed your body, but they also governed your personality. So there was a kind of psychosomatic link there. And the four humors were first blood, which was warm and moist and produced a sanguine personality. The second was phlegm, which was cold and moist and produced a phlegmatic personality. The next two are particularly interesting in relationship to this novel. One was yellow bile, which is warm and dry, which produces a choleric personality. And the second was black bile, which is cold and dry, which produces a melancholic personality. And choler, you can probably tell, in Greek actually means bile. And it's a word that is shared etymologically with both choleric and cholera. And since I've already admitted to not speaking Spanish, please, correct me if I'm wrong. From what I've read, cholera, and I hope I didn't just butcher that, in Spanish is a disease if the word is gendered masculine, but if it's gendered feminine, from my reading, it means passion. Or sometimes rage. So that to some degree, there's this kind of one word that can have the possibility embedded in it of meaning both sickness and passion. As I said earlier, in the Middle Ages, love sickness was called amor eros. And amor eros was at first thought of or talked about as erotic love, like eros. And then a silent H was mistakenly attached to the eros to become amor, Hereos, which was understood as a heroic love, a love that took a lot of strength, a lot of stamina, the ability to suffer deeply and over long periods of time. One of the most important theorizers of amor eros was Arnold of Villanova, who was writing in the late 13th and early 14th century. And according to Arnold, those most prone to be victims of amor eros were those with choleric personalities, personalities that seem to be warm and dry because, as he wrote, quote, heat stimulates the desire for coitus. Other medieval medical writers associated amor eros with the black bile personality, with a melancholic personality. But in either case, what happens when you fall victim to love sickness is that those humors in your body are out of whack, they're out of balance. And because they're out of balance, you've got to do something to bring them back into balance so that you're not perpetually suffering from love sickness. Love sickness was more common among men than among women, but women could also victims of it. And the symptoms of it, according to Arnold, and we find these, interestingly enough, all over the place in medieval imaginative literature. So all over the place in courtly romances and courtly love lyrics, it's the old trope of love at first sight. And the cause, according to the medical writers, was that a man sees generally a beautiful form and it causes him mad desire. So we see something like this when Florentino catches sight of Fermina in the sewing room, and that's basically the beginning of a half century of pining and loving for him. For the medieval medical writers, the brain is crucial here. It's like the mission control of love sickness, or maybe the mission out of control. It regulates the organism. And so some of the first signs that you see, and it's interesting that we see this exact kind of paradigm with Florentino. The first symptoms are mood symptoms, behavioral symptoms. There's sadness, there's sighing, there's weeping, there's pining, but gradually there's a metamorphosis into physical sickness that involve weight loss, thinness, a wasted look, a sallow face, hollow eyes, but even though your eyes are hollow, your eyelids are always swollen because you're crying all the time. It's kind of interesting to line up the symptoms of love sickness with the symptoms of cholera, which are dehydration, diarrhea, vomiting, sunken eyes, a kind of bluish tone to the skin, sometimes fever, and with the symptoms of bubonic plague, which, in addition to the famous buboes or swollen lymph nodes that are a sure sign that your life expectancy has just gotten cut perilously short, are fever, headaches, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and vomiting. So, I mean, courtly love starts looking, and love sickness starts looking an awful lot like the plague. There's also the fact that medieval love sickness brings with it the possibility always of dying for love. The medical writers write about it. It becomes one of the major plot points in medieval narrative. What you needed to do to balance the humors in order to tone down the effects of love sickness were some of the following. Wine was thought to do it, baths, evacuation. I didn't have time to do enough research about what exactly evacuation meant, and intercourse, especially with the object of desire. But if that just weren't possible with anybody else, including prostitutes, you could buy your remedy for love sickness. Music and conversation helped, but intercourse was really the what you were looking for. So how does all of this medieval medical background and medieval literary background help us at all in an understanding with love in the time of cholera? Well, for one thing, it looks like Florentino probably read Arnold de Villanova because he spends 50 years racking up 600 plus women's names in his Black Book of Women in order to try to distract himself from his love for Fermina. A quick Google search, and believe me, full disclosure, it was a quick Google search as I was trying to see if I could find evidence that Marquez was at all familiar with these traditions. And I'd like to actually do some more work on that, is that his work has been linked in a doctoral dissertation to the medieval Tristan romance and the love sickness there. And other essays have made note of the medieval Persian and Arabic influences on his work. And obviously, as I said earlier, those are the same influences that brought courtly love to Europe. In any event, I think at least we can claim that in the novel, Marquez is playing with the idea of love sickness, even and especially as he sets the events of the novel against outbreaks of cholera that in and of themselves become one of the novel's central symbols and themes. There's also the fact that in the courtly love tradition and also in the medical tradition that it would explain love sickness, you're almost fated by your very definition to become victim of love sickness unless you do something, as we would say, proactive about it. At least twice, and I thought, thinking back and reviewing my medieval medical lore, what's interesting is that at least twice, Florentino, on the verge of a key encounter with Fermina, has a somatic reaction that bears a distinct resemblance to cholera. So love sickness here, in his own love sickness, gets directly linked to disease itself, to a somatic disease. So after the young Florentino's given Fermina his first letter, quote, his anguish became complicated by diarrhea and green vomit. He became disoriented and suffered from sudden fainting spells. And his condition didn't resemble the turmoil of love so much as the devastation of cholera. His mother, who has watched the early symptoms of his love sickness, in their classical medieval symptoms, loss of appetite, sighing. She hears him restless and sleepless in bed in the room next door to hers, is really concerned. So she takes him to his homeopathic uncle, and his uncle examines him, and he concludes that it's not cholera at all. He concludes once again, quote, that the symptoms of love were the same as those of cholera. So it looks like this kind of, appropriation of sickness to love and love to sickness as something of a thing, as this homeopathic uncle knows. It's a reaction that repeats itself, interestingly enough, half century later, when Florentino drops in unexpectedly to call on the widow Urbino for the first time, only to be set with acute and acutely embarrassing gastric distress. It may be interesting to note here that most of the time he's constipated, and we get a lot of stuff about his enemas. But in these bookending encounters, at key points with Fermina, he has absolutely the opposite problem. Quote, the foaming in his belly grew thicker and more painful. It grumbled a lament and left him covered with icy sweat, end of quote. He beats a hasty retreat to his car where, quote, he closed his eyes, relaxed his muscle, and surrendered to the will of his body. So we can just imagine what happened there. His driver, who has seen a lot with Florentino, tells him as he leaves the car, quote, be careful, Don Floro, that looks like cholera, end of quote. Of course, we already know that it's only love. It's especially interesting then if episodes of seeming cholera mark decisive moments in the love affair, half century apart, that its most decisive, arguably conclusive phase unfolds under the yellow flag flying on the riverboat to signal a cholera outbreak on board. It's faux cholera, of course, but it gives the two old lovers the quarantine they need to hold space for their love. The ruse is plausible because, and this goes back to Dario's point, quote, everyone knew that the time of cholera had not ended, end of quote. Return to daily life at the end of their voyage for both Florentino and Fermina would be, quote, like dying. And so by flying the flag of contagion, they can maintain their quarantine back and forth down the river, as Florentino sees it at the end of the novel, quote, forever. What's most interesting and moving for me in this reading of the novel, as in my first, is Marquez's treatment of Fermino and Florentino as older lovers, and especially in relationship to the trajectory of love sickness in the courtly tradition. Marquez takes us temporally beyond the end point of cases of literary love sickness. Sure, Lancelot and Guinevere love each other for decades, but they don't die of old age. They die as a consequence of the tragic repercussions of their mutual love sickness. In most cases of love sickness, it's the young who die, or if they're lucky enough to be able to find true and everlasting love, they ride off towards a horizon where lies the kingdom of the ageless. Most courtly lovers never grow old. I mean, we just think of like the final scene in Disney's Cinderella, where the prince and Cinderella are waving out the back windows of the coach, and nobody knows how they grow up, grow old, what kind of dog they get, how many kids, anything else. But in this novel, at the time of life, when the body is most beset with the encroachment of old age, when the disease brought by time lies in wait, It's then that time cures love sicknesses. It's this time when the humors seem to balance. Sickness becomes uncoupled from love, so love can finally stand on its own. Just think how many times in the final movement of the novel, as Florentino and Fermina reconnect, how many times Marquez mentions the word calm. Florentino's letters, which take a completely different cast and are meditations on life and love, produce in Fermina a kind of calmness after the death of her husband. As Marquez writes, not too many pages from the end of the novel, they knew, quote, love was always love, anytime and any place, but it was more solid the closer it came to death, end of quote. Moving closer to death separates sickness from love, ironically, so that when their time comes, Florentino and Fermina will die not for love, but in it, moving back and forth, quarantined on the river, under a flag declaring love in a time of cholera. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And now we turn to Professor Aldrete.
Thank you, Maurice. I'm Diana Aldrete. My area of study is contemporary Mexican literary and cultural studies. So I want to give that disclaimer so that you know that I'm not a Garcia Marquez scholar. However, having read and taught Garcia Marquez's work, he is foundational reading in most undergraduate and graduate studies. I have read his work mostly in Spanish, but I reread this novel in English, and it's equally rich in language, which speaks to Garcia Marquez's longtime translator, Edith Grossman, who I had the pleasure of meeting and speaking to, and one of the funniest people I've met. And I have, she did tell us stories of Garcia Marquez. What I wanted to kind of focus on is on his influence on the literary movements, talk a little bit about the importance of him, but also on the themes that kind of keep coming up in his work, especially in the one that has been the most well-known, 100 Years of Solitude, which is the topic of solitude, not just in how we see it in this novel, not just in terms of the connection between love and solitude, but also in a more broader perspective, and how this term keeps coming up in some of the Latin American authors, that have used that and kind of put the perspective of Latin America as in this solitude, which he has spoken about. So his influence has inspired many literary movements in the later years of the 20th century. He contributed to putting Latin America on the map, I would say, not just in terms of the focus of Latin American literature, but also on the critiques that follow a history of abandonment, as he has mentioned before. Actually, in his acceptance speech of the Nobel Prize of Literature in 1982, titled "The Solitude of Latin America," he builds on the critiques of historical events that have affected Latin America, and in turn speaks about the undying Latin American spirit. And I quote him: "Latin America neither wants nor has any reason to be a pawn without a will of its own. The immeasurable violence and pain of our history are the result of age-old inequities and untold bitterness, and not a conspiracy plotted 3,000 leagues from our home. In spite of this, to oppression, plundering, and abandonment, we respond with life. Neither floods, nor plagues, famines, nor cataclysms, nor even the eternal wars of century upon century have been able to subdue the persistent advantage of life over death." End quote. And this is from his acceptance speech. I could also argue that his participation and influence in the literary movements of magical realism and the Latin American boom of the 60s and the 70s played a role in putting the Spanish-speaking continent on the world stage, as authors were widely read outside of Latin America. However, this did come with a price, as critics later pointed to the exoticization of Latin American literature marked by this blend of quote unquote, the real and the magical. In fact, this very marking was later critiqued by the literary movements of in 1980 or the 1980s with the Macondo, a play in words of the Macondo, which was the fictional city of 100 Years of Solitude, and also highlight the use of the globalization effect of the fast food chain McDonald's. So that Ncondo instead of Macondo as the fictional city. And it was also later used or later critiqued with the literary movement in Mexico in the 1990s with the crack generation. Crack not in the illicit drug, but as a complete rejection, the crack from a breakaway from the authors of the previous movements that Garcia Marquez was a part of to bring literature into more of a world literature. This later literary these literary movements that came later wanted to, contrary to Garcia Marquez, focus on writing that moved away from the rural portrayal of Latin American life into the urban cities that were influenced by technology and the globalized world in the late 20th century. Also, there was a focus on violence, the effects of that, of technology, of the globalization era, and how that contributed to the violence. And during that time, one of the most popular authors from that time was Roberto Bolaño, which came from that restless era of trying to push against the magical realism and Latin American boom. In particular, the influence of this novel after it was published in 1985 has had reverberating effects, finding its way to contemporary pop culture. From it, for example, being a symbol of fate in the movie Serendipity, starring John Cusack and Kate Beckinsale, to the television miniseries from last year, Love in the Time of Corona, which later found its way into the hashtag Love in the Time of Corona. But I digress, I'll come back to this at the end. As Garcia Marquez had warned his readers on this specific novel, quote, "You have to be careful not to fall into my trap," end quote. That trap, as I see it, is not to reduce it to a simple romance novel, but to pay attention at how the background dichotomies affect and push against the theme of love, whether that is in the exploring the issues of class and racial struggles in Colombia, that is Independent, which takes place during that time of the process of nation building, or Love and Death, or Youth and Old Age, or the colonial past versus the innovations brought on by modernity. In fact, love seems to be the sickness that has taken over Florentino Ariza in his obsessive infatuation with Fermina Daza, as my colleague explained. And then also in his this exploration of his, I believe it's 500 plus recounted sexual encounters. Florentino Ariza's story is one of unrequited love. As the narrator tells us in the beginning of chapter 2, quote, "Florentino Ariza, on the other hand, had not stopped thinking of her for a single moment since Fermina Daza had rejected him out of hand after a long and troubled love affair 51 years, 9 months, and 4 days ago," end quote. This love sickness is detailed in Florentino Ariza's character as he, quote, became disoriented and suffered from sudden fainting spells, and his mother was terrified because his condition did not resemble the turmoil of love so much as the devastation of cholera, end quote. And only to be confirmed in different occasions in chapter 2 that, quote, the symptoms of love were the same as those of cholera, end quote. Even when Florentino Ariza is on a fleet to go home in chapter 3, and I mentioned chapters because I was reading the English version on a Kindle, so it was really hard to really specifically find the page number. So just to give you an overview in case you want to go and read it. So when he was going back home on a fleet, he battles with the fact that Fermina Daza has married, and thinking about the newlyweds, his love turned into a feverish jealousy, as he is described again, quote, shivering with fever, fearing a case of cholera. And then when upon his return, again, we have the text kind of implying this love sickness of his, quote, through the labyrinths of sailing ships that lay at anchor, where the countless odors from the public market and the decaying matter on the bottom of the bay blended into one pestilential stench. Florentino Ariza was the first to jump on land, and it continues. And from that time on, he no longer detected the fetid reek of the bay in the city, but was aware only of the personal fragrance of Fermina Daza. Everything smelled of her, end quote. What I think Garcia Marquez is pointing to here is the topic again of the sort of personal solitude that love can have on us. And even he goes in deeper with exploring this topic even in marriage. We see this in the description of the love between the married couple, Fermina Daza and Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who understand even in their honeymoon that they do not love each other at that moment, but that that there was, quote, no obstacle to their inventing true love. So they knew where they were going to fall in love later on. And from Dr. Juvenal Urbino's last words to her as he is dying, this is confirmed as he says, quote, only God knows how much I loved you, end quote. But unlike Florentino Ariza, who suffers from cholera-like symptoms from an unrequited love, Dr. Juvenal Urbino's obsession with the disease has a personal impact along with an outward social critique, as we see in the text. First, his father, also a doctor, died of a previous cholera epidemic 6 years ago, from that time that it's being spoken on, while attending patients, which was, quote, responsible for the greatest death toll in our history. And then second, quote, his obsession was the dangerous lack of sanitation in the city, hoping that, end quote, hoping that his intervention could actually help to combat the disease. It is through his work that we see the effects of kind of the effects and the remnants of the post-colonial rule as the epidemic exposes the inequities of class and race. In chapter 3, we have a detailed account of Dr. Juvenal Urbino's appeal to renovate the colonial sewers and safeguard the drinking water, talking to the city council to impose obligatory training courses on the poor, just so that it could help with against the disease. In similar fashion, we have seen how the pandemic for us in our current reality has affected everyone differently, still drawing on social inequalities that are present. As we see in the novel, the dead succumb to the perils of the epidemic with little hope. Quote, the poor were sent to the colonial cemetery located on a windy hill that was separated from the city by a dry canal whose mortar bridge bore the legend carved there by order of some clairvoyant mayor, Lasciati ogni speranza voi che entrate. After the first 2 weeks of the cholera epidemic, the cemetery was overflowing and there was no room left in the churches, despite the fact that they had dispatched the decayed remains of many nameless civic heroes to the communal ossuary, end quote. The phrase carved at the entrance of the colonial cemetery, which is in Italian, reads in English, "All hope abandon ye who enter here," is a direct quote from Dante's Inferno as the sign before the gates of hell. This image of the impoverished, dystopic Latin American city has found its way throughout many novels after Love in the Time of Cholera, and even before, I'm sure. Again, the critique of the effects of imperialism, globalization, and neoliberalism later affected the continent. So I want to return to the topic of solitude for a moment, as it is a topic of focus for Garcia Marquez. In the novel, we see the loneliness associated with love. However, there is a larger critique on a more macro level. As mentioned in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize of Literature, Garcia Marquez actually paints a hopeful utopia for Latin America where, quote, "No one will be able to decide for others how they die, where love will prove true and happiness be possible, and where the races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have at last and forever a second opportunity on earth," end quote. 100 Years of Solitude, of course, is a direct reference to his magnificent novel that cemented him in the Latin American literary canon. Garcia Marquez was one of 6 Latin American authors to win the Nobel Prize of Literature, him being the 4th author from Latin America to win such a recognition. Before him, Gabriela Mistral, the only woman, in 1945, Miguel Ángel Asturias in 1967, Pablo Neruda in 1971, only to follow Garcia Marquez with Octavio Paz in 1990, and lastly, Mario Vargas Llosa in 2010. In fact, from this list, Octavio Paz, poet and essayist from Mexico, delved into the topic of solitude, which led him to write the book-length essay, The Labyrinth of Solitude, an exploration into Mexican culture and perspectives of death and identity given its own history. In his acceptance speech, which was titled In Search of the Present, Paz focuses his attention on the topic of modernity, not just from the innovative aspect in societal matters, but from a very Latin American literary genre of modernismo, or modernism, but it's not the same in the English language literary genre. Modernismo, which influenced his formation as a poet. The idea here is that both like Garcia Marquez and many of the authors who were influenced by him, there is a need for Latin America with its culture and its innovations to be recognized. A continental area that has been affected not just by colonialism, but also by the countless wars that were aided and abetted by foreign governments, and still wrestling to state its sovereignty against the pressures to quote unquote modernize without falling into the risk of being categorized as a rogue nation. And that's what a lot of Latin American countries go through. So to conclude, I want to draw attention on the topic of love in the novel to bring it to our current COVID reality, especially in terms of modernity and solitude. I mentioned that there was a discussion happening last year with the hashtag Love in the Time of Corona that initiated conversations around how to date during a pandemic, also how to survive the pandemic within enclosed pods. But I think the novel mirrors scenarios we are seeing right now between loving from a distance. I think of my sister, for example, whose partner is in Spain, and it's been very hard for them to actually connect without falling into all of our, we all are there, into Zoom or video chat fatigue. And then to face in the reality for some couples that, although they're together, they're, constantly together, they're in their own solitude. I believe that as I was preparing for this, I did a quick search, and I did read that there was an uptick in divorces since the pandemic started. But on a more global perspective, we see the insularity that we are in when we think of the pandemic, not just in terms of movement with no travel, but on seeing inequalities revealed in front of us, especially when it comes to state power. Right now, seeing the project of the vaccination and which nations are the first to get vaccines, for example. So I'll end it there, and I will mention that this novel, Garcia Marquez has mentioned that this novel was inspired by his own parents, and I'm paraphrasing him, but the only difference here, the only difference in his reality is that his parents got married, and not like we have with the characters in the novel. Thank you.
But we have a few moments for discussion. And I thought I would start things off by seeing if our panelists had any remarks or questions for each other before we turn to any questions from our viewers. So Dario, Sheila, Diana, do you have any comments or questions for each other? No?
No.
All right. Beth, did you want to take one of that first question?
Certainly. We have a question here. Can Diana Aldrete talk about the phrases "old man of her life" and "old women of his life"? Which struck me as I was reading in translation. And is there any special connotation in Spanish versus English? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm trying to remember, because the novel in English is fresh in my mind, so I'm trying to recall in Spanish the version in Spanish. But I'm not sure if the old is an adjective of past, or I would think that that's what it means, not that it's the women were old. There is I will say that, and I didn't mention it because I want to keep it intact, but one of the things that we see with the novel is that towards the end of the novel, we see Florentino and Fermina come together in more of an elderly age, and they're, I believe they even use the fleet. They raise the flag of cholera, meaning that there is someone in the fleet, so they can't disembark in the shore, to have more time for them. So it's interesting that I've heard this phrase before, that the only thing that surpasses death is love. However, in life, what we are dealing with, or we are overpowered with, is time, the losing of time, the time that passes. So here we have a couple that that even though they're elderly, they're kind of coming back to building on a love after decades, after half a century. But in terms of this, of the old man of her life, I'm trying to think of in Spanish. I'll have to Google it and get back to this if Sheila wants to take the next question. Well.
Okay, well, there is a question here for Sheila, which I'll read. Okay. The question is, I am curious about how, as a scholar of medieval literature, you would connect love sickness with the act of writing. Florentino's writing love letters of different sorts, the commission letters that Florentino writes, the novel itself, the tradition of courtly love, among other writing expressions in the novel.
when it comes to the courtly love tradition, the courtly love tradition was in essence a literary tradition. I mean, we think or tend to think of courtly love or romantic love, which is generally in this period of, strictly heteronormative kind of love, as trickling down and ultimately influencing human behavior. And I'm not saying that it didn't, but it took centuries for that to happen because, in essence, in an age of arranged marriages, writing and lovesickness went hand in hand. You articulated lovesickness through writing. And Diana pointed out that the inscription on the bridge of the pauper cemetery comes right out of the beginning of Dante's Inferno. Well, there's a lot of Dante scattered throughout Love in the Time of Cholera. And given the fact that Marquez quotes Dante in this context, he's got to have known about Dante and Beatrice and Dante's obsessive love for Beatrice, which looks very much like the beginnings of Florentino's love for Fermina. The fact that Dante basically becomes a poet, as he lets us know in La Vita Nuova, and this may be part truth and part a lot of fabrication, but in La Vita Nuova, he tells us basically about the growth of his totally platonic, never hoped to consummate love for Beatrice, and his birth simultaneously as a poet as he writes love poetry to her. So the two of them go hand in hand. Florentino is a voracious reader of literature and, is a really, there's a lot of humor, not of the Greek bodily fluid types, but a lot of just kind of funny, ironic humor in Love in the Time of Cholera. And part of it surrounds the fact that that Florentino just absorbs all the literature he can, all the love literature he can. He memorizes it. And the stuff he likes the best is the junk, the overly sentimental, overly emotional. So that to some degree, this is a literary tradition for him too. I mean, he's creating and participating in a literary tradition. And then his writings become most effective towards the end of his life, not when he tries to go back to a literary form that we could say is Florentino's juvenilia, his youthful literary outpouring, but when he starts writing meditations on what love means over the long haul. So yeah, it's very much a literary tradition that goes back to the Middle Ages, and Marquez is certainly playing with that in the novel, I think.
I'd like to ask a question for Professor Euraque. There's a question here. Can you speak to the tension between Colombian Latin identity and the European colonizers of centuries past? In their book, there seems to be an obvious resentment towards colonial history, but also a certain adulation of the European or use of it as a signifier of social status. Thanks.
Well, probably Diana could have more easily addressed that, but I'll take as they say in English, take a stab at it. Although I don't know if I want to use that kind of thing now. But I think that something that I could add to his historical context of when he wrote the novel in his lifetime. And he begins to write in the 1970s, or it was published in 1985. And why is that important is because it's a movement away from Europe that began long really in the 50s, and especially took off with the Cuban Revolution and his interest in Latin American cinema. And not just Latin American cinema, but cinema. For Latin America to have its own cinema, that's interesting. That would be an interesting a seminar in itself, because it was through his finances that really the first major, other than Mexico, but really advanced and avant-garde Latin American cinema began in Cuba in the 1960s and 70s. And So getting back to the question, of course, he's part of a general tradition of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and within that, a commitment to create for Latin America to have its own literature. I think that he would go further, though, and again, Diana would have much more to say, but he also was very interested in vindicating Caribbean Latin America. Oftentimes, particularly in the United States, the Caribbean is seen as or Latin America is seen as South America. In fact, I have colleagues who say, well, how is South America? As if somehow, there's something not called the Caribbean, and not just the island Caribbean, but the Central American Caribbean and so forth. So having its own literature was a kind of anti-colonialism itself. And with that, I could give it over to Diana. She might have more to say, but I'd like to make one comment, and a very ignorant comment. So bear with me, Sheila, because I'm not too sure. And I'm reading a biography, actually rereading a biography of Garcia Marquez that I'm teaching. I teach a course on biography as history. And one of the people we read is a biography by Gerald Martin, which is arguably the biography in English at any rate, of Garcia Marquez. And he's got a whole chapter on love in the time of cholera. And there's virtually no reference in there in terms of how this may be a dialogue in some ways with not just the medieval European tradition of love sickness and so forth, but Europe at all. Now, which doesn't mean that Martin got it right. I mean, it could be he's missing something, but, and then, again, I remember what I said, Sheila and others, that this is an ignorant comment. My sense is that there's also a love tradition of sickness in Latin America going back to the 15th, 16th century that he's drawing on, that I'm not familiar with. But after all, Latin America and the Caribbean, to say nothing of the 1,000 years before the Europeans arrived, there is a literary world and culture that, of course, involves humans and love and sex and everything else. And the Aztecs love sex, and sometimes they love to kill more than sex. But hey, so I just throw that out, Sheila, as an interesting question for you.
In my quick Googling, which was limited to very quick Googling, to see if I could find any trail of his knowledge of, actual knowledge rather than trickle-down cultural influence of a medieval literary tradition. There's given the fact that this tradition comes initially from Spain, the courtly love tradition, and then spreads throughout the rest of Europe. Given the fact that, as I was looking quickly, there seems to be, and I'm totally ignorant of this, a really powerful 15th, 16th century courtly love tradition in coming out of Spain. And the dissertation that I mentioned, that looked at the Tristan cycle and love sickness there, also was doing some work with Don Juan, which is a really powerful, example of love sickness and obsessiveness. So you're not ignorant at all. That's there. And we're both ignorant in the same way, but there seems to be traces of that.
Yeah. What do you think, Diana?
In terms of, I think the tension between the Latin American identity and whether it's adulation or rejection of the European history that ultimately has been in Latin America and still has its effects, whether it's class or even race. I think that what's interesting here that we have, for example, Dr. Juvenal Urbino, who goes to abroad and studies medicine and then comes back to find his hometown in ruins, and kind of this, he says, like, coming off the boat, it's like the stench and just realizing, whoa, this is, it's kind of, it's falling apart. Society is falling apart. This is not I would say this is not new for a lot of kind of, when we look at Latin American writers, the idea of going abroad and then coming back to write these great literary works is what, kind of, I think of, for example, Angel Rama, who wrote the book, The Lettered City. This is a tradition of imposing the city as kind of the lettered city. You have letrados, elite men who know, who are, intellectuals to build on, the empire, to help build the empire. And that continued on into the Latin American literary movements. And even revolutionaries, I will mention sometimes. So this idea of, having to leave in order to gain some quote unquote reason, if I don't want to use that per se to actually say that Latin America is devoid of that. But the idea that to leave in order to come back and come back with some substance to build on, whether it's a literary movement or a colonial society, that is a tradition that has happened. And now, more and more, where I think Latin America is wrestling with focusing more in terms of how how the effects of colonialism have affected even after independence. We see it again in class and race.
Can I, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Ask a question that any of you could speak to, or all of you if you wish. What do you make of the fact that this love affair is consummated in old age? And if I'm remembering the last chapter correctly, the consummation is rather tepid. It's a failure at first, and then when it finally happens, it's described as, well, I'll use that word again, rather tepid. What do you make of that? Do you make anything of that? Any of you?
I don't make anything of that.
I found really sort of powerful about that is that, there had been enough non-tepid stuff in this novel to, fill 3 novels. I mean, the temperature was pretty hot in most of the novel. And I think it was just really significant that by the time they finally get together, there is this sense of calm. And there is this sense of if you have all of the swings of amor eros, that's out of the way now. And they have kind of grown up and grown out of the need for this. So it's consummated. And there's the kind of physical movement towards death that, Marquez does not shy away from describing. But there is a sense that they have finally gotten to a point where they can deal with each other. And, he says they act like old married couple. They know each other so well at this point that it's almost like they're at the point in terms of their physical consummation that they would have been if they had been married all along. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
I thought it was actually powerful because I think that, I mean, I'm not going to go to the descriptions. I think the descriptions speak for themselves, but here are 2, and also, I mean, it really shakes our idea of love to not place it on young bodies. Here we have the description of both naked elderly people and, kind of the fail of the first attempt in this, sexual encounter, but the acceptance that, their bodies are what they are. And now they have, a time to explore, being in the moment of showing love to each other without having to think about kind of what youth left them. So I think it's very powerful, and it also kind of shakes the idea that or the taboo that at a certain age people can't have sexual encounters. I think that to me was very powerful, and yeah, I in my younger years, again, and I think I mentioned it to my colleagues in the emails before as we were organizing this. When I was younger, I didn't really care for the novel that much, and having read it in grad school, I had to dive obviously deeper. And then now, there are some rich sections of the novel that I really appreciate, and I think because I'm in a different also age, that I'm picking up also some critiques that I have of, for example, the pedophilia. But I think that was very powerful.
You want to say something?
Yeah, now actually the conversation has provoked me to move to my original comment was just to say that he was tired, by that point. After all, that little black book that he was signing, for about 50 years but more, I think more at a higher level of thinking, as my two colleagues were doing. I think another point is might be relevant here is the cultural notion. Actually, was introduced by Edith's questions about old and viejo and vieja and so forth.
Yeah.
In Latin American culture, age and old people being in love is not as bizarre as sometimes seems in at least my version of being brought up in the United States. It seems that love, and even sexual love, physical, including dancing, by the way, in much of the Caribbean, including Caribbean Honduras, for example, in San Pedro Sula, where Maurice has been to in Honduras, every Thursday there is the municipality organizes basically it's a public dance. And it's in the plaza. And basically what you see is what would here be called older people coming to dance. And they dance from pretty much in the early evening until late evening. And there's huge crowds of people who just watch the older people dancing. And they don't just dance in some sort of, distant dancing. I'm talking serious body to body contact here. But they're old people. They're old people, And in fact, the notion of viejo and vieja do not translate into old. And Diana can certainly say much more about this in terms of the language stuff. But for example, in Latin America, to be here, for example, senior citizens, so I don't know how you translate that in English, but in Latin America, at least in Honduras, it's you use tercera edad. There's a first age, a second age, and a third age. And so notice how viejo and vieja disappear. It's a third age. And I have some friends who say, well, I'm now moving into la cuarta edad. I'm moving into the fourth age. But I don't know, that's a lot of babbling, but I guess I think someone who actually knows more about these matters would probably be able to tie that into that it's not just two old people getting in, it's two old people in Latin America. Because remember in the novel, and I think I again, because I'm fond of the movie, in the movie when he's younger, he's also on that boat. I don't know if you remember what he's doing on that boat, right?
Yeah.
And he's very active. And so I don't know if that makes any sense to what I'm trying to get at about the specific cultural context of that.
Yeah, I will say that I think now that that you mentioned viejo vieja, there is a tendency, I think, in Spanish to say, obviously, I've mentioned this to classes. Language is cultural. How we see the world is shown into our language. So in Spanish, we may hear mi viejita, mi vieja, it's as a term of endearment. My old lady, the old lady of my life, for example. You will also hear the kind of mi gordita, like my chubby girl. So it's not to point at, to make fun of, but it's to accept that this person in their physical state is with me or is attached to me in a form of endearment. And I mentioned, the cultural idea or the taboo. I agree with Dario in terms of the difference between, love and even sex at an older age, different in Latin America versus here in the States. What I was referring to is more of the states of the taboo idea of in popular culture.
Well,
One of the things that I found really interesting in that last movement of the novel, and this goes back to your point, Dario, about the river being a conduit of disease. When they finally take the river journey, it's devastating. Whatever she had hoped to see, that he had told her about from his one trip, there's devastation. I mean, just needing to fuel the river boats has deforested the entire landscape. The manatees are gone, the iguanas are gone, and all the beauty that she expected to see is gone. And lest we take that as a kind of symbol of what's happened to their bodies, the landscape has been devastated by time and use and disease and whatever. Once they start flying that cholera flag, ironically, what happens is that they exist in this kind of idyllic universe where she makes eggplant a l'amour when she hated eggplant before. And she gets up one morning and looks, and there are fragrant roses and birds singing and a manatee nursing its baby, her baby. And so that and that almost seems like the kind of final image of the love between them, almost like a landscape restored that he wants to leave us with. I mean, this really magical realism, if there ever was any, but I mean, if you're an old person, we'll take it.
Well, it looks to me like our time has ended. Am I right about that, Beth?
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to thank so much to our three panelists, and thank you all in the audience for asking great questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them. I also wanted to thank the Center for Caribbean Studies, the English Department, Hispanic Studies, and LACS, Language and Culture Studies, for co-sponsoring this event today.
And this will be recorded and eventually made available online. And I presume you can contact Beth and/or Christoph to get the details about that. Thank you, everyone, for doing this. I learned a lot. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye.